The year was 2247, and humanity had finally joined the stars, becoming members of the great galactic consortium that stretched across 1,000 worlds and 10,000 species. Earth had changed so much in those years, with alien embassies rising in every major city, and strange ships filling the skies like metal birds from distant dreams. The old ways were fading fast, and the new ways brought wealth and wonder to a planet that had once nearly destroyed itself in war. Ambassador Chirictol stood before the viewing screen of their shuttle, watching the green and brown landscape of Montana scroll beneath them like a painting made of forests and fields. The Velkari ambassador was tall and thin, with a body covered in smooth chitin that gleamed purple in the morning light, and compound eyes that saw the world in fragments like a broken mirror put back together. Their species had been merchants and traders for 10,000 years, known across the galaxy for their careful nature and their deep fear of conflict. "We are approaching the property now, Ambassador," the pilot announced through the communication system, and Chirictol felt their antennae twitch with excitement. The base appeared on the horizon like a forgotten toy left in a field by a giant child. Rusted hangars stood in rows like the ribs of some ancient beast, and cracked runways stretched across the earth like old scars that refused to heal. Weeds had conquered the tarmac, pushing through every crack and gap with the patient strength that only plants possessed. The control tower leaned slightly to one side, its windows dark and empty, like the eyes of something long dead. "It is perfect," Chirictol whispered to themselves, feeling a warmth spread through their thorax. The Velkari had purchased this decommissioned military base through a galactic real estate auction, paying what the humans considered a bargain price for 300 acres of land and dozens of abandoned buildings. Most species wanted property in the busy cities where trade flowed like water, but Chirictol had different plans. They wanted peace, they wanted quiet, and they wanted a place far from the noise and chaos of human civilization, where their people could establish a trade outpost and live in comfortable solitude. The shuttle landed on what had once been a parade ground, and Chirictol stepped out into the crisp mountain air. Behind them came the rest of the delegation, 12 Velkari of various ranks and specialties, all of them clicking their mandibles with approval at the isolation of this place. No human cities for 100 kilometers, no major roads, no curious visitors to disturb their work. "Begin the survey," Chirictol ordered, and their people scattered across the base with scanning equipment and recording devices. The first day passed without incident, and the Velkari explored the crumbling buildings with growing satisfaction. The barracks could be converted into living quarters, the hangars into warehouses, and the old command center into a proper trading hall. Yes, this place had potential, and Chirictol could already imagine the prosperity that would flow from this investment. Night fell over Montana like a dark blanket pulled across the sky, and the stars emerged in numbers that the Velkari had never seen from their own polluted homeworld. Chirictol stood outside the shuttle, admiring the cosmic display, when a sound reached their sensitive antennae. It came from the far edge of the property, where the survey drones had reported nothing but an old aircraft graveyard filled with the rusting corpses of human war machines. The sound was strange and haunting, a mix of creaking metal and something that might have been a voice, deep and rumbling like distant thunder. "What is that noise?" asked Sub-Ambassador Velrix, who had come to stand beside Chirictol with fear obvious in every twitch of their limbs. "I do not know," Chirictol admitted, and they felt their own fear rising like cold water in their chest. The Velkari were not a brave species, and they had survived the dangers of the galaxy not through courage, but through caution and careful avoidance of anything that might cause them harm. Every instinct told Chirictol to ignore the sound, to seal the shuttle and wait for morning, to pretend they had heard nothing at all. But they were the ambassador, and they had responsibilities. "Send a drone to investigate," Chirictol ordered, their voice steady despite the trembling of their antennae. The drone lifted into the night sky and flew toward the aircraft graveyard, its cameras transmitting images back to the delegation's portable screens. They watched as the machine passed over rows of ancient fighters and bombers, their wings broken and their bodies covered in rust like diseased skin. Then the drone turned a corner around a massive transport craft, and something filled the screen. It was huge and dark, covered in what looked like scales of rust-colored metal. Two eyes glowed in the darkness like dying embers in a fire that had burned for 100 years. And they seemed to look directly at the drone with an intelligence that made every Valkyrie present shudder with primal terror. Then the footage cut to static, and the drone's signal disappeared. "What was that creature?" Velrix demanded, their voice rising to a pitch of panic that hurt Chirictol's hearing. "I do not know," Chirictol repeated, and this time their voice did shake. They contacted the local human authorities immediately, using the emergency communication channel they had been provided during the purchase process. A tired-looking human woman appeared on the screen, her hair messy and her eyes heavy with interrupted sleep. "This is Montana Regional Administration. How can I help you?" she asked through a yawn. "We have discovered something on our property," Chirictol explained, trying to keep their voice calm and professional, despite the terror still racing through their body. "There is a creature in the aircraft graveyard, something large with glowing eyes, and it destroyed our survey drone." The human woman stared at them for a long moment, and then her expression changed from confusion to recognition to something that looked almost like amusement. "Oh," she said, and a strange smile crossed her face. "You bought that base, did you? Nobody told you about Sergeant Kowalski." "Who is Sergeant Kowalski?" Chirictol demanded. "He is, well, how do I explain this?" The woman paused and seemed to search for the right words. "He is your neighbor, I suppose. He has lived on that base for longer than I have been alive. Longer than my mother was alive. He came with the property, you might say." "A human lives on our property?" Chirictol felt their confusion growing alongside their fear. But the base was listed as completely abandoned. "Abandoned by the military, yes," the woman agreed, still wearing that strange smile. "But Sergeant Kowalski never left, and nobody has ever been able to make him leave. He has certain, shall we say, legal protections, old veteran rights from the last war, the kind that nobody remembers how to revoke." "What do we do about him?" Chirictol asked. The woman shrugged her shoulders in that peculiar human gesture that seemed to mean everything and nothing at the same time. "I would suggest you introduce yourself," she said, "but be careful, Ambassador. The locals around here have a name for the old sergeant, one that has stuck for almost 50 years now." "What do they call him?" The woman leaned closer to her camera, and her smile grew wider. "They call him the Dragon." The communication ended, and Chirictol stood in silence, while the rest of the delegation buzzed with fearful questions and panicked suggestions. But the ambassador heard none of it, for their mind was fixed on a single terrifying thought. They had purchased a base, expecting peace and solitude, and instead they had found something that humans called a dragon waiting for them in the yard. 3 days passed after the drone incident, and the Valkyrie delegation refused to go anywhere near the aircraft graveyard that sat at the edge of their new property like a forbidden kingdom. They worked on the main buildings, they planned their renovations, and they tried very hard to pretend that the dragon did not exist. But every night, the sounds came drifting across the base, the creak of ancient metal, the hum of old machinery, and sometimes that deep voice singing songs in a language none of them understood. Chirictol could not sleep, and it wasn't just the fear that kept them awake. There was something else, something that their species called the burden of ownership, a cultural law that demanded any Valkyrie who held territory must face any challenge to that territory directly. To ignore a rival claimant was the greatest shame a Velkhari could suffer, worse than bankruptcy, worse than exile, worse even than death itself. On the fourth morning, Chirictal made a decision that shocked the entire delegation. "I am going to the graveyard," they announced at the morning meeting, and immediately every Velkhari present began clicking their mandibles in protest. "Ambassador, this is madness," Sub-Ambassador Velrix argued, their compound eyes wide with disbelief. "We should contact human authorities again. We should hire security forces. We should do anything except send you alone into the lair of that creature." "The burden of ownership is clear," Chirictal replied, standing as tall as their thin frame would allow. "I am the purchaser. I am the owner, and I must face this challenge myself. It is our way, and I will not abandon our way simply because I am afraid." No one could argue with the ancient law, though many tried. In the end, Chirictal walked alone across the overgrown tarmac toward the aircraft graveyard, carrying nothing but a translation device and a small emergency beacon in case everything went terribly wrong. The graveyard was even larger than it had appeared from the air, a maze of rusting war machines that stretched in every direction, like a forest made of metal. Fighter jets from a dozen different eras sat in rows, their canopies cracked, and their paint faded to ghosts of the colors they once wore. Bombers the size of small buildings loomed overhead, their wings providing shelter for birds and small animals that had made homes in the wreckage. Tanks and armored vehicles formed walls and barriers, creating pathways that twisted and turned without any pattern Chirictal could understand. The ambassador walked deeper into the labyrinth, following the sounds that had haunted their nights. The singing had stopped, but the mechanical noises continued, a rhythm of clicks and whirs that seemed almost like breathing. Fear wrapped around Chirictal like a cold fog, but they forced their legs to keep moving, forced their antennae to stay raised and alert. Then they turned the corner around the nose of an ancient bomber, and they found him. The human sat in a chair made from an ejection seat, positioned at the center of a clearing surrounded by aircraft wreckage. But this was not like any human Chirictal had ever seen in their years of diplomatic training. His body was wrapped in a mobility exoskeleton, a framework of metal and servos that covered his limbs and torso like armor. And the joints of this machine creaked with every tiny movement he made. His skin was wrinkled and spotted with age, stretched thin over bones that seemed too large for the flesh that covered them. And his eyes, oh his eyes, they glowed with an amber light that came from military optical implants so old that Chirictal had only seen them in history files. He looked like something from a nightmare, something that should not exist, a fusion of man and machine that had somehow survived far beyond any reasonable expectation. "Another new owner," the human said, and his voice was deep and rough, like gravel being crushed beneath heavy wheels. "You are the fifth this decade. The others left. You will too." Chirictal felt their legs trembling, but refused to run. "I am Ambassador Chirictal of the Velkhari Trade Consortium," they said, proud that their voice only shook a little. "I have purchased this property through legal channels recognized by both the Galactic Consortium and your human government. I have come to discuss your presence here." The old human, this Sergeant Kowalski that the authorities had mentioned, let out a sound that might have been a laugh or might have been a cough. "Discuss," he repeated, and his ember eyes seemed to flicker with something that could have been amusement. "That is new. Usually they just send lawyers or security teams. You are braver than you look, Bug." Chirictal chose to ignore the insult, recognizing it as the sort of crude humor that humans often used. "How long have you lived here?" they asked instead. 93 years, Kowalski answered, and Chirictal felt their antennae droop with shock. "That is impossible," they said before they could stop themselves. "Human lifespans, even with medical intervention, rarely exceed 120 years. And you, your condition, your technology, it is all so old." How are you still alive? Kowalski raised one arm, and the exoskeleton groaned with the movement like a beast waking from deep sleep. Military-grade cybernetics, he explained. The good stuff, from before they made everything disposable. My heart is mostly machine now, and my lungs, and about 60% of my organs. The docs said I should have died 40 years ago, but I told them I was not finished yet. The body does what you tell it to do if you are stubborn enough. Chirictal looked around at the clearing, seeing now the details they had missed in their initial terror. There was a small shelter built from the hull of an old bomber, with a door that actually worked, and windows covered with plastic sheets. There were containers of supplies stacked against one wing, marked with military symbols that the translation device could not identify. There was even a small garden growing in the shadow of a tank, with vegetables pushing up through soil that had been carefully tended. "Why do you stay here?" Chirictal asked, genuine curiosity finally overcoming their fear. The human authorities said you have legal protection, but protection does not explain why you would choose to live in such conditions. You could have a comfortable home anywhere with your veteran status. Kowalski's ember eyes dimmed slightly, and for a long moment he did not speak. The silence stretched between them like a living thing, heavy with weight that Chirictal could feel but not understand. "I have a duty," the old soldier finally said, and his voice had changed, becoming softer and sadder than before. "A duty to whom?" Chirictal pressed, taking a careful step closer. "To them," Kowalski answered, and he gestured with one mechanical arm toward a path that led deeper into the graveyard. "To the ones who cannot leave." "I do not understand," Chirictal admitted. The old human studied them for a long moment, his glowing eyes standing over the Valkyrie ambassador with an intensity that made Chirictal want to flee. But then something changed in his expression, something that the ambassador could not quite identify. "You came here alone," Kowalski said slowly. "You did not send soldiers or lawyers. You faced me yourself, even though you were terrified." "Why?" "It is our way," Chirictal explained. "The burden of ownership demands that I face any challenge to my territory directly. To do otherwise would bring shame upon my entire lineage." Kowalski nodded, and something that might have been respect flickered across his ancient face. "Duty," he said. "You understand duty. That is rare in my experience. Most species, most people, they forget their duties the moment those duties become inconvenient." He pushed himself up from his chair, the exoskeleton whining and clicking with the effort, and he stood before Chirictal like a tower of rust and determination. "Come with me, Ambassador," he said. "I will show you why I stay. I will show you my duty, and then you can decide for yourself whether you want to share this land with an old dragon who refuses to die." Chirictal followed the old human deeper into the aircraft graveyard, walking through pathways that seemed to have been carved with purpose rather than accident. Kowalski moved slowly, his exoskeleton making sounds like a creature in pain with every step. But there was no hesitation in his movement. He knew this place the way a person knows their own body, every turn and every obstacle memorized through decades of repetition. As they walked, the sergeant began to speak, pointing at different aircraft with a tenderness that surprised the Valkyrie ambassador. "That one is an F-22 Raptor," he said, gesturing toward a sleek fighter that sat beneath a makeshift shelter of metal sheets. "She flew in the Pacific Campaign, shot down 12 enemy drones before she was retired. Her pilot was named Williams. Best damn flyer I ever knew. They passed a massive transport plane, its belly torn open and flowers growing through the wound. C-130, modified for medical evacuation," Kowalski continued. "She saved 300 lives during the coastal bombardment, flying through fire that would have melted any other aircraft. Her crew called her the Iron Angel. Each aircraft had a story, and Kowalski knew them all. The bombers that had defended cities, the fighters that had protected convoys, the helicopters that had pulled soldiers from impossible situations. To him, these machines were not wreckage. They were monuments, and he treated them with the respect that such monuments deserved. But then the path opened into a clearing that made Chirictals stop in their tracks. It was a grove, a place where trees had been allowed to grow between the landing gear of ancient warbirds, where wildflowers covered the ground in colors that glowed in the afternoon light. The canopy of wings above filtered the sunshine into golden beams that fell like rain across the soft earth. And in the center of this grove stood rows of simple markers, stone tablets carved with names and dates that the translation device struggled to process. 47, Kowalski said, his voice barely above a whisper. 47 of them, buried right here where they lived and served and died. Chirictal counted the markers and found that the number was correct. Each stone was clean and well-maintained, with fresh flowers placed before many of them. Some had small objects resting at their bases, medals and photographs, and items whose meaning the ambassador could not guess. Who were they? Chirictal asked. Kowalski walked to the nearest marker and placed his mechanical hand upon it, with a gentleness that seemed impossible for such a rusted machine. My squadron, he answered, my friends. The last human war happened almost 100 years ago now, before your consortium knew we existed. It was a terrible war, fought with weapons that poisoned the land and the sky and everything in between. When the bombs fell on the cities, we were stationed here, forgotten by command, abandoned by a government that had bigger problems than one small base in Montana. He moved to another marker, reading the name there like a prayer. We survived, the 47 of us, but we had nowhere to go. The roads were destroyed, the communications were down, and the radiation made travel dangerous. So we stayed here, we made this place our home, and we waited for rescue that never came. Chirictal listened in silence, their antennae drooping with the weight of the story. The years passed, Kowalski continued. First contact happened, and humanity joined the stars, but nobody remembered us. We had been erased from the records during the chaos of the war, a clerical error that made us invisible to the new government. By the time anyone realized we existed, we were old and settled and unwilling to leave the only home we had left. He turned to face the ambassador, his ember eyes glowing brighter than before. One by one, they died, he said. Radiation sickness took some, old age took others, and broken hearts took more than I care to count. Each time, I dug the grave, I carved the marker, and I made a promise to never forget them, to never leave them alone in this place. But they are dead, Chirictal said, and immediately wished they had not spoken. Kowalski stared at them with an intensity that made the Velkari take a step backward. I know they are dead, he replied, his voice hard as the metal that encased his body. I watched each of them die. I held their hands, and listened to their last words, and closed their eyes when the light left them. Do you think I do not know that they are dead? Then why stay? Chirictal asked, genuinely confused. The Velkari do not maintain attachments to the deceased. When one of us dies, we return their body to the soil and move forward without looking back. What purpose does it serve to guard those who cannot know you are guarding them? Kowalski turned back to the graves, his exoskeleton creaking as he lowered himself to one knee before a marker at the center of the grove. This is Commander Patricia Shaw, he said. She led our squadron for 30 years after the war ended. She kept us together, kept us sane, kept us alive when living seemed pointless. She died in my arms, 91 years old, and still giving orders. His voice cracked, and for a moment, Chirictal thought they heard something that sounded like human crying. Her last order was simple, Kowalski continued. She told me to watch over them, to make sure their graves were tended, to make sure their names were remembered. She said that the dead can rest only when they know they are not forgotten. "And you have obeyed this order for how long?" Chirektal asked. 42 years, Kowalski answered, pushing himself back to his feet with obvious effort. 42 years of talking to them every morning, of putting flowers on their graves every spring, of telling their stories to anyone who will listen. 42 years of keeping a promise that I made to a dying woman. He turned to face the ambassador again, and his ember eyes were no longer fierce, but tired, so very tired. "You asked why I stay, and this is your answer. I stay because I promised I would. I stay because they deserve to be remembered. I stay because humans do not abandon their own, not in life and not in death." Chirektal stood in silence, processing everything they had heard. The Velkhari had no concept of this, no cultural framework for understanding a bond that extended beyond death. When a Velkhari died, their name was added to the consortium records, and their possessions were distributed among their heirs, and that was the end of it. No graves, no markers, no remembrance. But looking at this old human, this creature who had kept himself alive through pure stubbornness, just to tend the graves of friends who had been dead for decades, Chirektal felt something strange stirring in their chest. "I cannot ask you to leave," they said finally, surprising even themselves with the words. Kowalski tilted his head, his mechanical joints whining with the movement. "Your delegation will not be happy about that," he observed. "No, they will not," Chirektal agreed. "They will demand that I remove you immediately, that I hire security forces to drag you away from this place. They will say that sentiment has no place in business, that the dead are dead and the living must prosper." "And what will you tell them?" Chirektal looked at the grove, at the markers standing like soldiers at attention, at the flowers that bloomed in colors that seemed impossible in such a place of death. "I do not know yet," they admitted. "But I know that I cannot destroy this place. I know that I cannot take you away from those you have sworn to protect. There must be another way, a solution that honors both our peoples." Kowalski studied them for a long moment, and then he did something that Chirektal had not expected. He smiled. "You are different from the others," he said. "The ones who came before, they looked at me and saw only an obstacle. You look at me and see something else, though I am not sure what." "I see duty," Chirektal replied. "I see a burden carried without complaint. I see something that I was taught my whole life did not exist outside the Velkhari people." "And what is that?" "Honor," the ambassador answered. "True honor, the kind that survives when no one is watching and no reward is offered. I thought only my species understood such things, but I was wrong." Kowalski nodded slowly, his ember eyes glowing warm in the fading light. "Perhaps there is hope for us yet, Ambassador," he said. "Perhaps we can find a way to share this land after all." 1 month had passed since Chirektal first entered the aircraft graveyard, and the Velkhari trade outpost was slowly taking shape across the old military base. Construction drones worked day and night, renovating buildings and installing equipment that would transform this forgotten place into a hub of interstellar commerce. But there was a problem that grew worse with each passing day. The drones kept malfunctioning whenever they ventured too close to the graveyard. Equipment vanished from storage containers, only to appear days later in completely different locations. Supply shipments were delayed by what the transport companies called technical difficulties, though no specific cause could ever be identified. It was as if the land itself was fighting against the Velkhari presence. "This is sabotage," Sub-Ambassador Felrix declared at the emergency meeting that Chirektal had been forced to call. "The human is destroying our operations, and you are allowing it to happen." The accusation stung, but Chirektal kept their composure. "I have spent many hours observing Sergeant Kowalski," they replied calmly. "He barely has the strength to walk from his shelter to the memorial grove. His exoskeleton is failing, his power cells are nearly depleted, and his body is held together by technology that should have stopped working decades ago. He is not capable of the sabotage you describe. Then explain the malfunctions, Velrix demanded, their mandibles clicking with frustration. Chirictal could not explain them, and that was the truth. Something strange was happening on this base, something that defied the logical thinking that the Valkyrie prized above all else. The sensors detected nothing unusual. The security systems recorded no intruders, and yet the problems continued without any apparent cause. I have made a decision, Velrix announced, standing to address the entire delegation. Since our ambassador refuses to act, I have taken the liberty of contacting an off-world security firm. They will arrive tomorrow to remove the human by force, and once he is gone, these mysterious problems will surely cease. Chirictal felt their antennae flatten against their head in shock. You had no authority to do this, they said, their voice trembling with barely controlled anger. I have the authority of the Consortium Trade Council, Velrix countered, producing a holographic document that bore official seals. They have grown concerned about the delays in our operation, and they have granted me emergency powers to resolve the situation. The human will be removed, the memorial will be cleared, and construction will proceed as planned. The other delegates nodded their approval, and Chirictal realized that they had been outmaneuvered. Velrix had been working against them for weeks, filing reports and building a case, while Chirictal had been busy trying to understand an old soldier who refused to die. But before the ambassador could respond, an alert chimed from the base's external sensors. What is that? Velrix asked, their confidence wavering slightly. Chirictal checked the readings and felt their blood run cold. Humans, they said, dozens of them, gathering at the perimeter of our property. The delegation rushed to the observation windows, and what they saw made every single Valkyrie present freeze with fear. Along the fence line that marked the boundary of the base, humans were assembling, more humans than any of them had seen since leaving the major cities. They came in vehicles of all sizes, from small personal transports to large trucks filled with supplies and equipment. They set up chairs and tables. They raised banners with words that the translation devices could not quite parse. And they watched the base with eyes that held something far more dangerous than anger. Who are they? Velrix demanded, their voice rising to a pitch of panic. Chirictal studied the crowd and began to understand. Veterans, they said, spotting the medals and uniforms that many of the humans wore. Families of veterans, historians and preservationists. Word has spread about our plans for the memorial grove, and they have come to bear witness. Witness to what? To whatever we do next, Chirictal replied, and they felt the weight of those watching eyes pressing down upon them like a physical force. The humans did not threaten, they did not demand entry, they did not even speak through the base's communication systems. They simply watched, and somehow that was worse than any violence could have been. Their presence was a silent accusation, a reminder that the Valkyrie were not the only ones who remembered the dead. Chirictal made a decision in that moment, a decision that would change everything. Cancel the security contract, they ordered Velrix. I will not, the sub-ambassador refused. The council has given me authority, and I will use it to save this operation from your sentimental foolishness. Then I invoke the right of first voice, Chirictal declared, and every Valkyrie in the room gasped. The right of first voice was an ancient tradition, one that gave the original purchaser of any property absolute authority over all decisions regarding that property, for a period of 1 local year. It could only be invoked once, and it could not be overruled even by the Trade Council itself. Velrix had clearly hoped that Chirictal had forgotten about this right, but the ambassador had simply been waiting for the correct moment to use it. You would waste your right on this? Velrix asked, disbelief clear in every syllable. I would, Chirictal confirmed, and I will. Now cancel the security contract and arrange a meeting with the human community. We have much to discuss. The meeting took place the next day, in the shadow of the old control tower, where both species could see each other clearly. Chirictol stood alone before a crowd of nearly 200 humans, feeling smaller than they had ever felt in their entire life. But they remembered the memorial grove. They remembered the markers standing like soldiers, and they remembered an old man who had kept a promise for 42 years. "I know why you are here," Chirictol began, their translation device projecting their words in clear English. "You fear that we will destroy the resting place of those who served and sacrificed. You fear that we will forget them, as so many others have forgotten them over the years." The crowd stirred, but no one spoke. "I want you to know that I have seen the memorial," Chirictol continued. "I have walked among the markers, and I have heard the stories of those who lie there. I have met the dragon who guards them, and I have come to understand something that I never expected to learn from humans." They paused, gathering their thoughts. "My people do not mourn our dead," they admitted. "We consider death to be the end, and we see no purpose in maintaining connections to those who can no longer benefit from those connections." But watching Sergeant Kowalski, listening to his stories, standing in that grove where flowers grow between the wings of ancient warriors, I have begun to question everything I was taught. An old human woman stepped forward from the crowd, her hair white as snow and her eyes sharp as knives. "What exactly are you saying?" she asked. Chirictol stood straighter, meeting her gaze with as much courage as they could summon. "I am saying that I will not destroy the memorial," they declared. "I am saying that I will not remove Sergeant Kowalski from the land he has sworn to protect. I am saying that there must be another way, a way that honors both the living and the dead, and I am asking for your help in finding it." The crowd murmured, and Chirictol saw expressions changing from suspicion to something that looked almost like hope. "I am proposing a partnership," the ambassador continued. "The Velkari will build our outpost here, but we will do so around the memorial, not through it. The aircraft graveyard will become a protected sanctuary, a place where humans can come to remember their heroes, and where my people can learn what it means to truly honor those who came before." The old woman studied them for a long moment, and then she smiled. "My grandfather is buried in that grove," she said. "I never thought I would hear a Velkari speak of honor. Perhaps there is more to your people than we assumed. Perhaps there is more to all of us than we assume," Chirictol replied. "And perhaps it takes a dragon to teach us what we have forgotten." 1 year had passed since the meeting that changed everything, and the old military base had transformed into something that neither species could have imagined alone. The Velkari trade outpost rose in gleaming towers of purple metal and crystalline windows, a monument to interstellar commerce that attracted merchants from across the galaxy. But at its heart, surrounded by walls of respect rather than division, the aircraft graveyard remained untouched, a sanctuary of rust and memory, protected by laws written in 2 languages. Chirictol stood at the entrance to the memorial grove, watching as a group of young Velkari followed an ancient human through the pathways between the broken wings of forgotten warbirds. Sergeant Major Kowalski moved more slowly now than he had a year ago, his exoskeleton reinforced with Velkari technology that hummed quietly instead of creaking in pain. The repairs had not been given to extend his life, only to extend his ability to tend the graves and tell the stories for a little while longer. "This one is called a Mustang," Kowalski was explaining to the younglings, his ember eyes glowing warm in the morning light. "She was designed during a war that happened 300 years ago, before your people knew Earth existed. Her pilot was a woman named Chen, and she flew 200 missions without ever losing a wingman." The Velkari younglings listened with antennae raised in fascination, their compound eyes tracking every gesture the old soldier made. They had never seen anything like this, a living being who served as a bridge between the present and a past so distant It seemed like legend. Their culture had no equivalent. No elders who kept the stories alive. No guardians who protected the names of the dead. Guardian Kowalski, one of the younglings asked, using the title that had been officially granted to him 6 months ago. Why did humans build machines for war? The Valkyrie have never understood this. Kowalski paused beside the Mustang and placed his mechanical hand upon her wing with the tenderness of a parent touching a sleeping child. Because we were afraid, he answered honestly. Afraid of each other. Afraid of the unknown. Afraid of losing what we loved. Fear makes people do terrible things, youngling, and war is the most terrible thing of all. But fear also makes people brave, and brave people do incredible things to protect those they care about. Is that why you stay here? Another youngling asked. Because you are brave? Kowalski laughed, a sound like stones rattling in a metal container. Brave, he said. I am stubborn, which is a completely different thing. Brave people face their fears and overcome them. Stubborn people just refuse to stop, even when everyone tells them they should. Chirictol smiled at this, understanding now what they had not understood a year ago. Humans were not the warriors that the galaxy believed them to be, not primarily. They were something far more dangerous, something that no species had ever truly prepared for. They were keepers, guardians of memory and promise, who refused to let go of what they loved, even when death itself demanded surrender. Later that evening, Chirictol sat in their office and composed the final version of a report that they had been writing for months. It was addressed to the Galactic Consortium Council, and it would be read by representatives of 1,000 species across 1,000 worlds. They chose their words carefully, knowing that this document might change how the entire galaxy understood humanity. We believe that humans were merely persistent, they wrote. We observed their expansion across the stars, their relentless exploration, their determination to overcome every obstacle, and we concluded that they were simply a species that did not know when to quit. We were wrong. Humans are not persistent in the way that we understood persistence. They are anchored, bound not to places or possessions but to each other, to the chains of memory and promise that link the living to the dead and the present to the past. Their dead do not leave them, and they do not leave their dead. This is not weakness, as some have suggested, but strength of a kind that most species cannot comprehend. To purchase human land is to inherit human memory. To live among humans is to be adopted into their remembering. They will share their stories with anyone who listens. They will tend the graves of strangers who earned their respect, and they will fight to protect the names of those who can no longer speak for themselves. They are not dragons in the way that old myths described, creatures of scale and fire who hoarded gold in mountain caves. They are something far more dangerous, keepers of a flame that cannot be extinguished, guardians of promises that survive beyond death itself. Their treasure is not material, but spiritual, a wealth of memory and meaning that grows greater with each generation. I have learned more from one elderly human soldier than from all the diplomatic training my species provided. I have learned that honor is not a Valkyrie invention, that duty is not unique to our culture, and that the bonds between beings can transcend the boundaries of death in ways I never imagined possible. My recommendation to the Council is simple. Do not underestimate humans. Do not dismiss their sentimentality as weakness, or their attachment to the past as inefficiency. These are the very traits that make them unstoppable, the chains that bind them together into a force that no empire has ever successfully broken. And if you ever find yourself sharing land with one of their guardians, one of their dragons, do not try to remove them. Instead, listen to their stories, learn from their devotion, and allow yourself to be changed by what you witness. You will emerge a better being for the experience. I promise you that. Chirictol signed the report and sent it to the transmission queue, then made their way out of the office and toward the memorial grove. The sun was setting over Montana, painting the sky in colors that no Valkyrie world had ever produced, and they wanted to witness it from the place that had become sacred to them. They found Kowalski sitting among the graves, as he always did at this hour, speaking softly to markers that could not hear and would never respond. A young Valkyrie sat beside him, the same youngling who had asked about bravery earlier that day, listening with an intensity that warmed Chirictal's heart. "And then she looked me right in the eyes," Kowalski was saying, his voice soft in the evening air. "And she said, 'Kowalski, you are the most stubborn man I have ever known, and I am ordering you to stay that way.' Those were Commander Shaw's last words to me, and I have followed that order every day since." The youngling clicked their mandibles in a gesture that Chirictal recognized as deep respect. "Will you tell me more stories tomorrow, Guardian Kowalski?" they asked. "Tomorrow, and the day after, and every day that this old body keeps working," Kowalski promised. "The stories are not mine to keep, youngling. They belong to everyone who will listen, and my job is just to make sure they are never forgotten." Chirictal stepped into the grove and stood beside the old soldier, looking out at the markers that stood like soldiers at eternal attention. "The consortium will name this outpost tomorrow," they said. "We have chosen to call it Kelthara Kowalski, which means the place where memory lives in our language. It is the first time in Valkyrie history that we have named anything after a single individual." Kowalski turned to look at them, his ember eyes glowing bright in the fading light. "I am honored," he said, and his voice cracked with emotion he rarely showed. "You have taught us something that we did not know we needed to learn," Chirictal replied. "You have shown us that there is more to existence than profit and progress. There is memory, there is duty, there is love that survives beyond the grave. These are human gifts, and we are grateful to have received them." The sun dipped below the horizon, and the stars emerged in their countless thousands, watching over the grove where the dead rested and the living remembered. Sergeant Major Elias Kowalski, 143 years old and more machine than man, sat among the graves of his friends and smiled. He had kept his promise, and now others would keep it with him. The Valkyrie would eventually spread this understanding across the galaxy, teaching 1,000 species what one stubborn old soldier had taught them. They would build memorials and guardianships. They would learn to honor their dead and remember their heroes. And they would always trace this change back to a forgotten base in Montana, where a dragon had refused to leave his post. And in the evening light, surrounded by the markers of the fallen and the flowers of remembrance, the dragon and the hive sat together in perfect peace, listening to the silence that is never truly silent when memories are alive.